Hellfire Part 4. Nick watched the last go inside. Deputy Merriman scrutinized him and gave the go-ahead gesture. His smile assured him it wasn't a request. He nodded and thanked him, but wanted to punch the sorry pig. Nick hated being manipulated. Liars hated being lied to. He saw the interior decor as rural, simple, and straight Appalachian. White walls held plain iron candle holders, no electricity in evidence. It hurt Nick's eyes, and flames danced, making light shimmer and uneven. Solid oak pews had thin red velvet cushions. Nick hated them. They were incredibly uncomfortable. The seats were made purposely to be unyielding, and no sense in being comfy under the threat of damnation. The podium stood straight across from him, waiting for him. Old, handmade, and appeared welded to the spot. Nick strolled along and smiled at the people oblivious of them. He walked to an open seat, though Merriman stopped him with a large hand. Silently, he raised a finger that pointed at the podium. Usually, he followed the regular preacher, the warm-up act. He went up front smoothly, changed steps, and laughed self-deprecatingly. The slight variation of routine off-putting, he stared at the ancient podium. Roughly carved form, crudely hewn from a single piece of wood. A shelf for papers, which he had none. All the sermons memorized. His frown deepened. He saw something wedged up in the back. He shook himself, approached, and looked at the patient crowd. As he introduced himself, a hand slipped onto the shelf, then supple leather. It couldn't be a heart, barely even looked lifelike. Of course it wasn't. He sighed inside, relieved. The sea of stupid faces stared at him like dumb cattle, and suddenly he hated them. Nick began the sermon chosen specifically for a Hellfire church. The deputy had insisted on real fire and brimstone on their first meeting. All of Nick's sermons adhered to that formula. The start was very simple: sin. What it was, how it worked, its benefits and the drawbacks of immorality. Earthly and the existential ramifications are stated calmly and thoughtfully. Sin was evil, he told them tranquility, and a few smiled. Nick hit them with damnation. The sudden shift of his demeanor startled. Agony promised to those who refused to repent. Describing torments, he screamed them at the congregation. Running back and forth, he undid the top few buttons. Nick raved like a madman, face reddening. The promise of hell poured upon them like hot coals. The crowd reacted avidly, and a few began to stand, praying and swaying. Calming suddenly, he switched tactics instantly but smoothly. The salvation offered like a life preserver, the only alternative to the fires below. The life path, everlasting, however hard, had to be zealously sought. A reward of redemption being with God, a mansion, reunited with loved ones, and even pets ready for their masters. All it took was a choice, an active decision to choose the light over the dark. Nick held arms open to receive them while delivering this bid of deliverance. The open arms of forgiveness are like God's. The members sat down, their passions cooled visibly. Scowling inwardly, he continued, feeling suddenly a little sick. Urge to vomit crushed him. Sweating, a hand went to his head as he talked. The world wavered and became a little unstable before coagulating back to its boring truth. Shakily, he asked them what the sinner's reward for iniquity was. Again, he hit them with damnation, a lake of fire and agony unending. Nick stomped every step. He bellowed, spit flying, face turning a dangerous purple. Nick confessed sins and most inventions, lamenting such transgressions against a loving God. He almost laughed, having damned enjoyed them. More stood this time, and he could feel them pulled in by the words. Going back to the topic of salvation, he could feel them cool, not interested. Breathing hard from his exertions, the sickness returned worse than before. Disconnected, the world spun. Urge to vomit nearly toppled him. They only cared about damnation, and if they wanted hell, they would have hell. Returning to the podium, he fell silent, inclining forward, the congregation leaning closer. Screaming, they jumped back from the sudden force. He described the vilest torments. They wanted more of everything described. Torture porn for the unrepentant rendered in vulgar verbal brushstrokes. The agony was so sickening that the angels in heaven wept at the suffering, tore apart for eternity, and resurrected after each death to begin the misery once more. Sin would irrevocably and undeniably damn them to hellfire eternal. The congregation nodded their agreement. "God, please show me the truth!" Nick screamed the words climax to the sermon, the only line he still meant, arms outstretched to embrace all, his head turned up to speak to God. Nick grimaced again, delivering the last line wrong. The sick feeling returned on the heels of the confusion. A sense of unreality quickly followed. Lowering his head, the urge to vomit brought it down. Torches replaced candles, and crisp white walls were replaced by burnt stone. Pews also disappeared with the congregation forced to stand. Hot air became scalding, a thick, miasmic, choking cloud that looked dingy and quickly made skin raw.